The sun never truly leaves the Egyptian desert. Even at dusk, when the horizon blurs between gold and blood, a faint warmth still clings to the ancient stones. Somewhere beyond the reach of modern roads, between ridges of time-worn hills, the Valley of the Kings lies as it always has, half buried, half watching. Beneath layers of wind-blown sand and forgotten prayers, there is a silence that has outlived language. It hums low, just below hearing, like the final note of a hymn that no one remembers how to sing. The stone faces carved along the cliffs do not speak, but they do not sleep either. Their gaze has not shifted in thousands of years, yet something behind them feels unsettled. Everyone knows the story, or so they believe. A boy king, barely old enough to rule, laid to rest in a tomb that was somehow missed by time. His name etched in gold, his mask gleaming with reverence and sorrow. Tutankhamun, a name that echoes through museums and schoolbooks, a relic wrapped in myth and certainty. And yet, even the most brilliant light casts a shadow. For every documented relic and carbon-dated artifact, there lingers a question that refuses to settle. Why was his tomb untouched when others were plundered? Why was it small, hastily decorated, lacking the grandeur of even lesser rulers? And why, after its discovery, did so many who stepped inside never step out again? Some say it was a coincidence, others a curse, but perhaps both are missing the point. Perhaps the truth is not hidden, but simply not seen. Not because it is invisible, but because it was never part of the history we were meant to understand. There are cracks in the walls of every known fact, hairline fractures that let in the faintest breath of something older, colder. Something that was never meant to be unearthed. What if the tomb was not made to preserve a king, but to contain something else? What if the walls were painted in haste not due to lack of reverence, but out of urgency? A desperate attempt to seal something shut before it could whisper out. The artifacts, the treasure, the mummified remains, were they offerings or warnings? Symbols of wealth or signs of a boundary crossed? Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the desert wind sweeping over the valley. Feel the shift beneath your feet, as though the ground itself is remembering something you have not lived, but almost recall. The scent of dried myrrh, the clang of distant chisels, the flicker of oil flames casting shadows that move just slightly too much. It is not now. It is not then. It is somewhere in between, a breath caught between centuries. We often assume that the past lies behind us, cleanly marked and boxed in. But in truth, it waits beneath us, around us, in the spaces where light does not reach and sound dares not echo. A coffin is not always a prison, and silence is not always peace. Tonight, let's wander where no maps can guide us. Welcome to Forgotten History. There are places where even daylight feels borrowed, where the sun filters through the dust not to illuminate, but to remember. In such places, the air moves slowly, thick, as though carrying something unspoken, a weight that does not settle on the body, but lingers beneath the skin. And sometimes, even when the world outside is warm and real, a single step inward can feel like falling backward into something that no longer belongs to time. Beneath the southern Taurus Mountains, near where Anatolia dips toward what was once the edge of the ancient Hittite world, archaeologists uncovered a cluster of stone structures buried under sediment and silence. They named it the Hallan Subterrane, initially believed to be a funerary site from the late Bronze Age. 13 rooms, each distinct, carved into the limestone like hollowed ribs beneath the earth. Altar stones, ossuaries, faded etchings of a sun cult long forgotten. But in the 12th month of excavation, a graduate student, tired, brushing soil from an already mapped wall, noticed something odd. Faint breeze from nowhere. Then, beneath a layer of fractured rock, they found what appeared to be a sealed threshold. It had no hinges, no iconography, no reason to be there, and when they breached it, they discovered a 14th room, or rather, the absence of one. Unlike the other 13, this chamber had no carvings, no pottery shards, no remains. It was narrow, low, and unnaturally dark. Flashlights flickered when pointed inside, not from battery failure, but as though the light itself hesitated. As though this room had never been touched by illumination and resented the intrusion. Dr. Marcus Lindt, the Austrian lead on the Hallen team, described it in his notebook. The room breathes, not with air, but with presence. There is no dust, yet everything feels coated. Clara says she hears dripping water when she closes her eyes. But there is no water, not even damp. The map of the site, copied from Hittite blueprints found miles away, made no mention of a 14th space. There were no structural reasons for it to exist, and yet it did. A room not planned, not built, but found. Even stranger, the room had no ceiling. Instruments raised upward found nothing. No resistance, no measurable end. At 20 meters, the laser disappeared. They tried a tethered rope. When they pulled it back, it was damp, cold as if dragged through something that was no longer air. And the smell, Lindt again. It reminds me of iron left too long in fire, or blood before it dries. But metallic isn't the right word. It's older, like breath sealed in stone. After several visits, 5 researchers chose to leave the project. One of them, a technician named Andreas, mailed a short letter to Vienna before his departure. I dream of someone walking above me, but I am on the floor. I never see them. Their steps are hollow, and I am too afraid to look up. Local folklore offered little more than fragments. Elder villagers nearby, whose language still held traces of Hattic roots, referred to the mountain slope as Tzirai, loosely translated as the place where oaths die. They spoke of a group of pilgrims or priests who once came to bury a sound that should not be heard. None of them returned. Another tale whispered that the 14th room was not built by hands, that it grew like a bruise within the bedrock, that the original builders merely built around it, afraid to disturb whatever it was sealing in. Some believed the room was a gate, not to another place, but to a time before the current one. Not a portal, but a memory, trapped, looping, unwilling to fade. Then there was the light. On the last documented entry into the room, and in turn noted something odd on her camcorder. When she replayed the footage, she saw a glint in the upper right corner of the frame, a small, pulsating glow. It flickered rhythmically, almost like breath. But no light source was present in the room, and none of the team reported seeing it in real time. When she paused the video and brightened the frame, the glow vanished entirely. 2 weeks later, the Hallen site was sealed. Officially, the closure was due to safety concerns, unstable rock, risk of collapse. But none of the other chambers showed signs of weakness. Only the 14th room. All notes, photographs, and recordings were transferred to Ankara. Some leaked, most didn't. But among the files copied before lockdown was one final page from Dr. Lindt's field journal. It bore no date, no location, only a line written in uneven script. I'm not sure I ever left the 14th room. Since then, the entrance to the Hallen subterrane remains unmarked. Locals refuse to point its way, but they say that when storms roll in from the coast and thunder echoes across the slopes, you can sometimes hear a sound that doesn't belong to the wind, like water dropping in a room that shouldn't exist. That night, the wind chimes outside the village temple kept ringing, though no wind passed through the corridor. Some places forget, others remember, but just a few wait, like a wound never closed, like a name whispered once and never again. And in one quiet cemetery in the hills of southeastern France, there is a gravestone that has waited for far too long, not because no one visits it, but because someone did and found no one there. It began with a storm. In October of 1978, a flash flood struck the tiny village of Cazeneuve, just beyond the older Roman roads that curve around the foothills of the Cevennes Mountains. Old trees were uprooted, footpaths collapsed, and a section of the cemetery's retaining wall crumbled into the ravine. The villagers worked together to rebuild what they could. In the process, they uncovered something unexpected. A grave had shifted, not just exposed, shifted. The headstone, belonging to one Étienne du Fontenay, 1821 to 1864, had tilted inward toward the ground, as if pulled. Curious, the workers lifted the slab. But beneath it, no coffin, no bones, only soft, dry earth, untouched. According to parish records, Etienne was buried on the 17th of March, 1864, with full rites. The service was led by Father Bellier, whose diary still sits in the village rectory. In his own handwriting, he wrote, "The boy had no kin. We laid him beside the old chapel wall, facing east. He did not look at peace. The boy man really was 23, died suddenly. No illness, no injury. Just found one morning, in the chapel pews, eyes open. A doctor was called from Alesh. The body was declared deceased, but no one wrote down a cause, only a date. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. In 1982, a woman named Elise, descended from the original chapel caretaker, returned to the village with a faded photograph. The image showed a man with deep-set eyes, standing beside a well, one hand clutching a book with no title. She claimed it was taken in 1913, in Algiers, and that the man was Etienne. The village laughed it off. A trick of resemblance, surely. But Elise insisted. She'd found the photo among her grandmother's things, tucked in a letter signed E.D.F. The handwriting, curiously, matched a known sample of Etienne's from his years in the seminary. Stranger still, when authorities attempted to search the grave again, just to confirm its emptiness, it was sealed. Not with concrete, with stone, set so precisely it appeared ancient, though it had not been there a decade prior. The local mason swore he hadn't touched it. Inquiries were made. The mayor at the time agreed to open the Fontenay family crypt in nearby Nîmes just in case. There was no record of Etienne ever being moved there. But inside the crypt, in a back alcove no larger than a pantry, was a small, sealed wooden chest. No inscription, no keyhole, just a blackened iron clasp. When the chest was finally opened, it contained three things. A rosary, silver, but with a missing cross, a page torn from a diary, in Latin, and a dried flower, not native to France. The Latin text, once translated by a linguist from Avignon, read, "He refused the vow, and so was left between." Between what? Life and death? Memory and erasure? No one knew. The rosary was sent for testing. The flower could not be identified. The diary page vanished, misplaced in an office move, or so they said. Then came the sightings. From 1990 to 2003, reports surfaced from 3 different countries, each describing a tall man, early 30s, with a calm demeanor and a worn brown coat. He carried no bags, spoke softly, often found near old churches. In each case, he left behind a scrap of paper. Same signature, E.D.F. No records exist of someone matching Etienne's full name born after 1864. But the handwriting, checked by a forensic specialist in Lyon, matched the original burial records, down to the curl of the final Y. The theory began to circulate. Etienne had not died, but stepped aside, not disappeared, not fled, but shifted, out of chronology, a fracture in his timeline, perhaps by choice, perhaps not. The villagers call it l'sommeil debout, the standing sleep, a term they use for people whose stories never close. Graves with no bones, names with no endings. One local legend, barely whispered now, claims that Etienne studied under a Jesuit sect that believed certain rituals could unhook a soul from time. Not to gain immortality, but to remove memory, to make one a ghost who still walks. Another version claims he saw something he shouldn't have. During a storm, near the well behind the chapel, a reflection that wasn't his, a voice from below, and that after that he never cast a shadow again. No one knows the truth. The grave still stands, tilted, the stone still cool to the touch, even at noon. The name faint now, nearly rubbed smooth. Sometimes, when fog rolls in from the valley and the chapel bell rings, though no one pulls the rope, visitors say they see a man standing near the edge of the cemetery, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. And that night, the candle in Father Bellier's old room flickered once, though no one had lit it in years. Sometimes the world ends more slowly underground. The light above dims gently, replaced not by darkness, but by the weight of depth. There's a moment just past the seventh step when silence thickens. The air becomes older, and if you listen long enough, the walls begin to sound less like stone and more like breath. In the northern reaches of Cappadocia, where volcanic rock forms valleys like melted wax, lies the ruined shell of a Byzantine monastery carved directly into the cliffs. Locals call it Yedinci Basluk, the seventh hollow. Tourists rarely visit. There are no signs. The frescoes have faded into bruised stains, and a soft, constant wind whispers through the tunnels as though afraid of being overheard. The monastery was rediscovered in 1961 by a pair of shepherds chasing a lost goat. What they found was a structure hidden behind a collapsed outcropping. Rooms shaped like domes, narrow passageways, and a descending spiral staircase carved entirely by hand. It curved down into the mountain in perfect symmetry, each step precisely measured. But what caught the attention of archaeologists wasn't its design. It was its end, or lack of one. The first official team that entered the staircase stopped counting after 300 steps. The walls showed no changes, no markings, no temperature shift, just more of the same. Smooth, cold basalt and the smell of dust that had never seen sky. They called it the endless descent. In one field report, an assistant named Hakan wrote, "We kept walking down for over an hour. I dropped a coin, it never hit bottom. But when we stopped and turned to go back up, we reached the surface in just minutes." No one remembers climbing. That same night, he developed a fever, claimed his dreams were vertical, that he was falling, but not quickly, just slowly enough to realize he would never land. He left the project the next day and burned all his notes. The monks who had once lived in the monastery had left no written records, only a single carved phrase found above the threshold to the staircase. In ancient Greek, it reads, "Where the last bell never rang." What bell? No bell was found, no belfry, no tower, and yet, every few years, hikers and wanderers have reported hearing a low metallic hum in the valley, always from beneath their feet, always just at the edge of hearing. A German historian named Dr. Elke Hartmann visited the site in 1987. She had been researching hidden early Christian sects and believed Yedinci Basluk might have been home to a group that practiced silent monasticism, a discipline that rejected all light and voice in the name of purification. She descended the staircase alone with a tape recorder. When she returned 3 days later, she was visibly altered. Her hair had gone entirely white, her pupils unresponsive to light. She would not speak, only hum a single note, low and trembling. Her recorder had captured exactly 7 hours of silence. But then, at the very end, a sound. Not words, not footsteps, just something like a bell being struck slowly, and breathing long, measured, rhythmic. Dr. Hartmann was admitted to a hospital in Vienna. She never recovered her speech, but in her final written note, she scribbled, "The stairs don't lead down, they lead away. Some believe the staircase was a trap, not for people but for something else, that its descent was never meant to be reached, that each step further invites noticing, and that what notices does not sleep. Others say it's older than the monastery, that the monks built around it, attempting to seal off what they could not remove, that the carvings in the walls, long since worn smooth, once warned pilgrims to step only to the 13th level, and never on the 7th day. In 2002, a government-funded team attempted to seal the entrance. They filled the top 20 steps with concrete, poured stone into the shaft. Yet a month later, the seal cracked, not from pressure below, but from within the mixture, as if it had dissolved from the inside. The monastery is now abandoned again. The wind still flows from within it, and hikers still report hearing what sounds like slow footsteps on stairs, though none descend. And once, in 2011, a photographer captured a long exposure shot inside the entrance. The image was clear, but at the far end, just where the last visible step vanished into shadow, there was a blur, a shape that was not a shadow, not a person, just there. No one could reproduce the image. The negative was lost. Today, locals avoid the area, not out of fear, but respect. Children are taught not to shout near the cliffs. No names are spoken near the threshold, because sometimes, when the valley is quietest, the sound of a distant bell can still be heard, low, hollow, waiting. And that evening, the hiker who stayed too long near the stairs returned to camp with shoes covered in fine gray dust, though he swore he never stepped inside. There are drawings that reveal the world, and then there are those that seem to remember it. Not maps of where we've been or even where we might go, but maps that suggest something already knows. Something watching, tracing, recording, even before we arrive. In 1935, a modest estate in Cornwall was passed down to a young cartographer named Julian Hearn. The manor, stone-chilled and wind-worn, had belonged to his grandfather, a reclusive academic rumored to have worked with esoteric societies during the early days of the British Geographical Survey. Hearn, eager to catalog the property, began by restoring the house's personal library, mostly forgotten volumes, some uncut, most brittle. But in the far back corner of a sealed drawer, he found a scroll. Not a map, not at first glance. It was unmarked vellum, dry but uncracked, wrapped around a thin rod of wood that had darkened with age. But when unrolled, something strange began to appear. Lines, slowly, faintly, as if lifted from the air. Within minutes, shapes began to coalesce. Contours, rivers, valleys. None matched the landscape outside his window. None matched any known topography. And yet the scale was precise, the detail impossible. Julian noted the phenomenon in his field journal. The ink is not visible when rolled. It develops with touch, as though the skin warms it into memory. He traced the lines, attempted to identify landmarks, hills that dipped into nothing, forests arranged in spirals. One symbol in particular caught his attention. A perfect circle, etched in heavy black strokes, positioned near the center. It was surrounded by 6 smaller circles. No key, no legend, but at the bottom edge of the parchment, written in a faint serif script. Not where it is, where it waits. In the following weeks, Julian became obsessed. He compared the map with medieval texts, ancient pilgrim charts, even navigational logs from ships that never returned. Nothing matched, but one pattern emerged. Every time he unrolled the map, the lines shifted slightly. Not random, they evolved. In one version, a river bent east. The next day, it bent west. Mountains rose where valleys had been. And once, briefly, a small red dot appeared in the lower right corner. He marked that location in his own coordinates. Traveled there. Found only an overgrown field, choked with moss and nettles. But in the dirt, buried beneath tangled roots, he found something. A shard of porcelain. It was smooth, curved, like part of a cup or bowl, glazed in a pattern he couldn't identify. Concentric rings, like echoes frozen in glaze. He brought it home. That night, he unrolled the map again. There was a symbol where the red dot had been. Cup. After that, Julian began documenting every change. Photographs, sketches. He sent samples to Oxford, to Edinburgh, to no reply. Some nights, he claimed to hear scratching from the room where the map was kept. Not mice, he said, but motion. Paper brushing paper. Ink dragging itself across fibers. One morning, he awoke to find a new mark on the map. A shape, small, human, standing at the edge of a drawn hill. It looked up. Julian wrote only one more entry in his field journal. It knows I see it. He was last seen in December of 1936. His home locked, fire burning, no signs of struggle, but the map gone. The drawer where he kept it was empty, its velvet lining smooth as if never used. Years later, in 1958, a French geographer named Claudine Bellard published a niche paper on non-terrestrial mapping patterns in medieval scrollwork. In a footnote, she mentioned the Hearn manuscript, an alleged living map whose last known coordinates placed it somewhere along the Cornish cliffs. She called it an attempt to draw the world from the inside out. The phrase puzzled historians, but in her private notes, Bellard described a conversation she had with a local who had known Julian. The man, a groundskeeper, recalled seeing Hearn standing at the edge of his property some nights, staring out at the moor, holding the map open in front of him. But the wind never moved the paper. Even during a gale, it hung perfectly still, as if held in place not by hand, but by intention. In 1997, hikers discovered an abandoned campsite near Bodmin Moor. Inside the tent, a notebook, water damaged, mostly illegible. But one sentence remained. It added a new road last night, one that ends at my door. No map was found. Today, locals speak of the pathless scroll, a legend of a document that adapts to its holder, not to guide, but to observe. It is said to appear only to those who read maps by moonlight or who follow trails not yet trodden. And sometimes, on fog-heavy nights, people wandering the hills claim to see paper drifting through the mist, floating level, straight, and glowing faintly from within. And that evening, when the fog had settled and the wind fell still, a hiker awoke to find a crease in the ground, one that hadn't been there before, stretching out from his tent like a line drawn in ink. There are spaces that absorb more than sound, spaces where memory feels suspended, where even your own footsteps seem uncertain. Deep within the ruins of an abandoned sanatorium in northern Bavaria lies a room that, by all accounts, should not be there. The building itself had been forgotten for decades, left to rot beneath ivy and frost, its records lost during the final months of the war. When a restoration team arrived in 1994 to document the structure for potential historical preservation, they noted 13 patient rooms per wing. Standard, symmetrical, predictable. But on the eastern corridor of the south wing, past a hallway no longer visible from the main floor plans, they found a door. The wood was darker, untreated. It had no handle, no lock, only a shallow indentation where the grain had split inwards. Behind it, a single chamber, square, featureless, lined with smooth stone and eerily silent. Not the quiet of disuse, but something heavier. A silence that wrapped itself around the body like wool soaked in fog. What struck the team immediately was the acoustics. There were none. A researcher clapped once and heard no echo, not even the faintest reverberation. Her voice, when she called out, sounded flat, like it had fallen to the ground. She claimed she could hear her own heartbeat, but not the breath of the person beside her. Measurements showed the room to be perfectly cubic, 4 meters by 4 meters by 4 meters. No windows, no vents, and beneath the dust, no markings, except for one word etched into the ceiling, almost too faint to read. Verfallen, the German term for decay. No such room appeared on any blueprint. No workers could explain its construction. The stone wasn't local. It had been set without mortar, pressed so tightly that even water could not pass through the seams. One of the crew, a man named Reinhold, refused to step inside. He said the room reminded him of a memory he couldn't quite place, of standing in his childhood home, but without walls, without sky, just the feeling of being watched from beneath. Over the next few days, those who spent more than a few minutes in the room reported odd symptoms. Pressure behind the eyes, dizziness. One woman lost her sense of direction and walked in circles for nearly 15 minutes, despite the room's size. And one by one, the team stopped returning. By week's end, only 2 remained. On the 7th day, the remaining lead, Dr. Petra Walls, attempted to run a series of auditory tests. She played a series of tones from a portable speaker. None registered on the recording device. None bounced. And when she reviewed the footage later that night, she noticed something stranger. For the 5 minutes the test ran, the room was visible. Then, briefly, the camera screen went black, just for 3 frames. When it returned, the shadows had shifted, but not in line with the light source, as if something within had moved. Petra returned alone one last time. She entered at 6:12 a.m., leaving her recorder running. Her voice can be heard clearly at the start. She narrates her steps, describes the air, the absence of sound. Then, for the next 42 minutes, nothing. No footsteps, no breath, only the soft static of silence trying to be heard. And then a whisper, not in German, Not in any language recognized by linguists later consulted. Just a single sound, repeated 3 times. Something close to a name. Then her voice returns, but it's quiet, almost beneath the microphone. "I understand now," she says. "It's not that sound can't escape. It's that it doesn't want to." She never left the room. By the time security arrived, the space was empty. No signs of struggle. No traces of exit. Only the recorder, left in the center of the floor. Still running. The room was resealed. Bricked over. The sanatorium once again abandoned. Locals say it still stands, buried beneath growth and silence. That if you walk far enough past the old birch line, you can find the outer wall cold even in summer. Some nights, they say, you can place your ear against it and hear breathing. Not loud, not human, just waiting. And once a boy dared to knock. 3 times. The wall didn't respond, but his voice was never the same. It lost its echo, forever. And that night, the wind on the hill stopped, but a bird in the rafters began to sing, though its beak never opened. There are places where the world seems thinner, as though something waits just beneath the surface, watching through a veil too fragile to hold its weight much longer. In the village of Montilar, tucked between the fog-drenched hills of northern Portugal, there is a stone well older than the church, older than the road, older than the name of the village itself. It sits beneath the roots of a crooked fig tree, moss-covered and sunken, forgotten by most and avoided by all. Locals call it O Alho, the Eye. No one remembers who built it or when. The stones that line it are not of the region. They're smooth, ash-colored, and laid in an inward spiral that seems to twist tighter the longer one looks. There is no rope, no bucket, no sound of water, but every child is taught the same rule. Never look directly into it. Not because it's dangerous, but because sometimes it looks back. The first written mention appears in a convent diary from 1781, penned by a young nun named Ines. She wrote of a villager who claimed to see something moving in the water. Something that didn't ripple, didn't speak, but shifted when watched. Ines ventured out one dawn to see for herself. Her final entry reads, "I gazed, and it was not my face. I blinked, but it did not. I breathed, but it did not. And I think it waited for me to stop. Over the years, others came. A traveling priest tried to bless it. He vanished the next morning, his rosary found tangled in the fig tree's roots. A painter sketched it from a distance. When he returned to his studio, the canvas showed only a dark spiral, dripping with ink that had never touched his brush." In 1939, a Portuguese folklorist named Eduardo Caldas visited Montilar to document village myths. He recorded the well, took measurements, and returned to Lisbon with a small vial of water drawn from its depths using a mirror and pulley contraption, never looking directly down. That night, the vial cracked. No one heard it break, but the water inside had vanished. The glass remained cold for 3 days, even when placed in the sun. His notebook from that trip contains only one sentence beneath the diagram of the well. It doesn't want to be seen. It wants to be remembered. Scientists sent in the 1960s to study groundwater systems in the region were shown the well, reluctantly. Their instruments recorded no depth. The sonar pinged once, then nothing, as if the bottom absorbed sound. When they lowered a light, the filament burst without a sound. The wire, when pulled up, was frayed, as though unwound strand by something with far more patience than claws. And then came the reflection. One geologist, a woman named Teresa, leaned over the edge with polarized glasses. She didn't speak for hours afterward. When asked what she saw, she whispered, "Not me, but someone who knew me before I was born." She resigned the next day. Locals resumed their silence. In recent decades, the well has been fenced, overgrown, nearly hidden again. But still, people find it, drawn by stories, by whispers, by dreams of places they've never been but somehow recognize. One traveler claimed he felt his reflection step away as he looked down. Another reported hearing a soft knock, like knuckles on wood, echoing up from below. Always 3 taps, always slow. The well remains dry, But every autumn, for 1 hour on a night no one can predict, mist rises from within it, cold, unscented, and humming. Not a tune, not language, just a steady pulse, like breath held too long. Some believe the well is not a place but a memory, one too heavy to die, too curious to remain still. Others say it is a mirror made before mirrors, crafted not to reflect light, but to return the gaze of something deeper than water. And those who linger too long, who lean just a little too close, begin to feel the subtle shift. That the surface is not still, that their shadow stretches where it shouldn't, that the face they see waiting beneath is not theirs. And that night, as the fog thickened and the wind died, a fig leaf floated gently to the edge of the stone well. It curled, paused, and then was pulled downward, vanishing without a sound. Some texts are not written to be understood. They exist not to explain, but to remain, to persist like a whisper through centuries, changing shape each time they're heard. In a quiet alcove of the Strahov Monastery Library in Prague, past shelves of illuminated gospels and faded atlases, there once rested a book without title, author, or date. Its binding was stiff, veined like old bark, and cold no matter how long it sat in the sun. Archivists labeled it simply Codex 349. It was discovered in a locked drawer during a cataloging project in 1968, behind a false panel few had ever noticed. No record of its donation or acquisition exists. Its cover bore a single symbol pressed into the leather, an eye without a pupil, surrounded by 7 lines like rays pointing inward. When first opened, the pages appeared blank. But under candlelight, never electric light, text began to emerge. Not all at once, just a few lines at a time, curling into visibility like smoke from a wet wick. The language was unidentifiable, glyphs resembling a hybrid of Arabic, Greek, and something far older, shapes that bent inwards, as if folded into themselves. Yet readers claimed to understand it, not in words, but in meaning. The head archivist, Joseph Fulsek, described it as reading in memory, not in voice. Each time he returned to the book, the passages had changed. Not the handwriting, that stayed the same, but the content. A parable about a city with no shadows became, days later, a diagram of a machine that harvested silence. Another time, a single word repeated across 13 pages. Revertum. When asked what it meant, Joseph whispered, "To go back to what we never were." On the 4th reading, he fainted. The candle he used to illuminate the text burst, though no flame had touched the wax. His eyes took days to focus again, but he refused to stop. He became convinced that the Codex did not record events. It remembered the readers, that each person who opened it was reflected within its pages, distorted, echoed, reduced to symbols it could reshape. He was not the first. Tucked in the back cover, hidden between the stitching, was a thin note in Latin, older than the binding. It read, "This book is not for the eye, but for what watches behind it." Other staff began reporting strange sensations. Headaches, pressure in the temples, a persistent scent of damp paper where none existed. One assistant claimed she could hear whispering from the Codex, even when it was closed. When asked what it said, she replied, "It doesn't speak, it reminds." Eventually, Joseph sealed the Codex in a wooden box lined with salt and left it in the restricted archives. He labeled it non-circulandum, do not circulate, but before locking it away, he made one final note. It was found in his journal, dated the night before his death. It wrote me today, my name, my thoughts, from when I was 6. I had forgotten, but it hadn't. His death was ruled natural, but his eyes remained open, unblinking, as if still trying to read something only he could see. Since then, Codex 349 has been consulted sparingly, mostly by researchers with special clearance. Yet none have read it twice. A condition of access now requires the reader to sign a waiver. You may view its page, but it may view you as well. In 2009, a visiting scholar from Argentina reported seeing a phrase in English clear, centered, written in clean serif. "You're not the first." When she returned a day later, that page was blank. She never visited again. Some now believe the manuscript is not a book, but a boundary, a mirror that only shows you what you were before you learned to speak. Others think it's a collection of unfinished thoughts, gathered by something that cannot write, but longs to. Whatever its origin, one detail remains unchanged. The final page, always blank, always warm to the touch, always faintly damp, like breath just exhaled. And that night, as the library bell tolled midnight, a single candle flickered in the sealed archive. Though no flame had been lit, a thin curl of smoke rose from the lock. Some structures do not point to heaven. They turn slightly, just enough to go unnoticed, bending their angles away from the stars, as if avoiding something or hiding from a gaze not cast by the sun or moon. In the heart of the Taklamakan Desert, beneath layers of sand fine as sifted flour, archaeologists uncovered the foundations of a temple unlike any other on record. Its walls, partially buried and worn smooth by centuries of wind, formed a perfect octagon. 8 walls, each identical, flawless in measurement. But it was not the symmetry that drew attention. It was the direction. Every ancient temple in the region aligned with known celestial markers, the cardinal points, solstice paths, the rising of specific stars. But this one leaned 13 degrees off true north. No sun traced its corridors at equinox. No constellation matched its angles. Faced nothing. And yet, every stone had been laid with intent. Measured, cut, positioned as if responding to something outside the sky itself. The excavation team, led by a Kazakh researcher named Layla Askarova, at first assumed it was a miscalculation by ancient builders. But the further they dug, the less likely that became. Beneath the top layer of bricks, they discovered a substructure. Deeper, older, untouched by later modifications. In the very center of the temple lay a platform, circular and smooth, with a shallow basin carved into its surface. No soot, no ashes, only dust that refused to settle. Instruments placed inside would shake subtly, as if reacting to a vibration too low to be heard. One assistant reported that his watch stopped every time he stepped into the basin, and resumed only once he stepped out. When they attempted to map the structure using drones and GPS, the images returned warped. Lines bent, angles refused to hold. The entire temple, when viewed from above, seemed to shift slightly, as though drawn from memory instead of design. One image, later dismissed as a software glitch, showed a shadow across the sand, tall, angular, with no source. Local folklore offered little. The area was largely uninhabited, with only passing nomads to reference. But an old Uyghur story spoke of a place where the stars fall silent, a temple that was built not to honor the heavens, but to shield against them. It was said that in ancient times, the sky opened for one night, and something fell not like fire, but like thought. It landed where no light could follow, and the people, afraid of what had arrived, built walls around it, not to worship, but to trap. Layla discovered something else. On the inner face of each octagonal wall, etched so faintly it was invisible to the naked eye, were lines of text in an unknown script. When lit from below with infrared, the markings glowed faintly. Not ink, not paint, but some kind of mineral embedded in the stone itself. The lines did not form words. They spiraled inward, always inward, toward the basin, and on the 8th wall at the spiral's center a symbol appeared. A dot, encased in a broken ring. A seal, perhaps, or a wound. During the final week of excavation, a storm rolled over the desert, rare, dry, electric. The camp's generators failed. Several tents collapsed. Layla remained in the temple overnight, alone, refusing to leave the basin. The next morning, they found her asleep on the platform, unharmed. But when she awoke, she asked a question in a language no one recognized. Then, quietly, she said in English, "It doesn't rise, it listens." She never returned to the site. Her notes became cryptic, filled with sketches of inverted constellations and angles that pointed nowhere. She drew the temple again and again, each time tilted more, as if slowly turning its back on the cosmos. The excavation was shut down. Sand reclaimed the edges. The official report cited structural instability, but within the team, whispers continued. That something beneath the temple pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat. That compasses spun if held too long near the basin. That the sky, directly above the structure, always seemed just a little darker, even at noon. And once, briefly, a researcher swore he saw a single star blink out overhead and not return. Today, the site is marked only by a single rusted stake. No signs, no roads. Satellites pass over without recording. Tourists never come. But in quiet hours, under cloudless skies, the nomads say the air above the desert sometimes turns still, as if something below is listening for a sound not made yet. And that night, a single grain of sand trembled on the surface of the basin, though there was no wind to move it. Some places are never built. They arrive, not with ceremony or sound, but like breath drawn in before speech. There is no record of their founding, no trail leading to their doors, and no reason they should be where they are. In the wooded hills of northern Belarus, where maps turn vague and roads end in roots and stone, there was once a village that appeared only between seasons. Locals called it Vezdits. The name translates, roughly, to always there, though no one could quite agree where there was. The first written mention comes not from a geography book, but from the travel diary of a Polish postal courier in 1811. He described getting lost in fog, stepping off the main road to rest, and waking up beside a well-kept cottage with yellow shutters and a woman sweeping the stone steps. She welcomed him, gave him bread, pointed him back toward the road. But when he looked back, an hour later, the village was gone. Years later, a Russian military surveyor noted a cluster of rooftops between cedar ridges on a morning ride. He drew it into his field map: small houses, a watchtower, a clearing with a bell hung in a wooden frame. But when the map was cross-checked with aerial photographs, nothing appeared. The area showed only forest, no signs of structures, no clearings, and no bell. In 1972, a pair of botanists studying fungal growth patterns near the border recorded a series of notes about a settlement not listed on any registry, where the trees curved unnaturally and birdsong stopped midair. They visited the place twice. On the first visit, they walked through narrow paths lined with moss-covered stones, saw gardens, chickens, smoke rising from chimneys. A child waved. On the second, 5 days later, there was nothing. No path, no stones, only pine needles and silence. One of the scientists, a woman named Anka, never returned to research again. In a letter to a colleague, she wrote, "I think the place dreams itself, and we were in its dream." The few who claimed to visit Vezdits always described it similarly. Small wooden homes, a central square with an old tree, a bell that never rang, and a smell, not unpleasant, but strange, like rainwater stored in silver. The villagers, if seen, were kind, smiling, quiet, but no one ever heard them speak. They only gestured, and every visitor remembered the same moment, the turning point, the place where they realized they didn't belong, not from hostility, but from something more subtle, a glance that lingered too long, a hand paused at a doorframe, the sense that the village was not built for them, that they were not guests but noise. In 1996, a satellite radio technician noted a brief interference pattern when scanning low-frequency bands across the region. The anomaly lasted 6 minutes. It repeated 3 days later, same duration, same coordinates. When the signal was translated into sound, it resembled slow, irregular breathing. It was tagged as atmospheric distortion and archived. But one analyst at the time, a man named Sorokin, kept a private copy. He listened to it every night for 2 weeks. On the final recording, beneath the static, he believed he heard a word. Just one. Home. He died the following year. No cause was confirmed, but his journal contained a crude sketch of a village square, drawn in pencil with a note in the margin. "I never saw anyone ring the bell. Maybe they're waiting." In 2004, a hiker uploaded a blurred photo to an obscure online forum. It showed a crooked tree growing from cobbled ground, a narrow roofline behind it. He said he'd gotten lost during a solo trek, found a quiet place with soft voices and warm food. When he returned a week later with his GPS, the coordinates led to an overgrown clearing. The stones were there, but scattered, as if a village had once been lifted from its foundations without a trace. Since then, no clear sightings have been verified, but rumors persist. Stories whispered by travelers, rangers, old women selling herbs near the trailheads, that the village still appears just briefly, in the minutes before mist rolls in the hush between snowmelt and frost, a place that does not wish to be known, only remembered. Some believe it is a refuge, a place once lost, now folded between the seconds. Others think it's a memory not of our world, but of a different one, a world that sighed once and left its breath hanging in the trees. And perhaps, for those who walk without asking, for those who stray too far from their own paths, Vezditz is not a detour, but a home they were never meant to leave. And that night, deep in the forest where no trails meet, a bell sounded once. Not loud, but enough to make a deer stop, turn its ears, and walk away without looking back. Time doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it turns gently in place, like a leaf drifting in still water. And in a town just beyond the edge of modern memory, there once stood a clock tower that measured time not by the sun, nor the moon, nor the ticking beat of progress, but by something that had never left. The village of Wellberg, nestled in the low hills between two long-forgotten trade roads in southern Germany, was ordinary in every way except for one. At its center stood a stone tower, narrow and moss-covered, with a clock face carved directly into the slate. No hands, just numbers, 12 of them, arranged in a perfect circle but without a mechanism. The villagers called it Die Rucker, the returning clock. It made no sound, kept no time, but every year on the night before the winter solstice, the numbers would change. They didn't move, they reversed. What was once 12 became 11. 11 became 10. The shift happened in silence, just after midnight, while the town slept. And in the morning, they would awaken to a new year with a clock that read backward. No gears, no wind, no explanation, just stone numbers arranged against the drift of the world. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. No photographs exist of the first clock face, but one elderly resident, a woman named Elsbeth, kept a hand-drawn record passed down from her grandfather. The sketch showed the tower with its numbers counting forward, as any normal clock would. But he wrote in the margin, "It used to follow the sun. Now it follows something else." When questioned, Elsbeth could never explain what he meant, only that her grandfather had stopped speaking the day the numbers first reversed. In 1933, a visiting ethnographer named Dr. Carl Merton came to Wellberg to document rural folklore. He noted the villagers' reluctance to discuss the clock, their habit of walking around the tower instead of past it, and their refusal to mark time by its face. Everyone in Wellberg wore watches, but no one wound them. When asked why, one farmer replied softly, "Because we're not the ones keeping time anymore." That winter, Dr. Merton stayed to witness the solstice. At 11:58 p.m., he set up a camera across from the tower. He sat. He waited. At 12:03, the film jammed. The shutter stuck open. When he reviewed the negatives the next day, all but one were blank. The final image showed the tower, but with two overlapping sets of numbers, as though time had hesitated. On one side of the clock, the digits curved forward. On the other, they curved back, as if the tower had not chosen a direction, but held both. Dr. Merton left soon after. His last field note reads, "It doesn't tell time. It remembers it, and it's forgetting less each year." Over the following decades, the village changed. Electricity arrived. Roads were paved, but the clock tower remained untouched. No vines grew on its surface. No birds nested in its narrow slits, and the stone never weathered. Scientists were brought in once, after a local teacher noticed a strange magnetic pulse near the base of the tower. Instruments failed, compasses spun, and at the center of the tower's shadow, audio recorders picked up a low hum, rhythmic, steady, pulsing exactly once every hour. Except the pulses came slightly sooner each day, as if something were closing in. In 1985, A child named Lucas began sketching the clock every morning. He had never been taught Roman numerals, but each drawing showed the numbers reversed, perfectly proportioned. When asked why he drew them, he answered, "Because that's how the tower counts to 0. His parents moved away that year. The sketches stopped. But his final drawing showed the number at the top of the clock no longer as 12, but as nothing, just a blank curve, as if the final digit had been erased. The villagers began to whisper that the clock was not measuring hours, but distance. Not how far they'd come, but how close something else had gotten. And with each year the numbers reversed, they were not losing time, but proximity. That when the final reversal came, when the clock counted back to its beginning, the space between them and whatever it guarded would collapse. That it was not a clock at all, but a lock, a mechanism for holding time still, until time ran out. In the year 2000, the numbers on the tower stopped changing. The face read I at every position. The villagers boarded their windows. No one rang the church bells. And for one whole day, no sound passed through the village. Not even birdsong. When night fell, a low chime rang from the tower, one that no one had ever heard before. No source was found, but the sound echoed across the hills like a name whispered backwards. The next morning, the numbers returned to their reverse state, now beginning again from 11. A loop, perhaps, or a reprieve. Since then, the tower has been watched, studied, avoided, but never touched, because even now, as the years pass and the world forgets, the villagers still know what the clock counts. Not hours, not days, but the space between now and something that once was and may still be. And that night, as the wind coiled around the tower and the moon held its breath, the numbers glowed faintly, just long enough for a passerby to see them flicker. Backward, once more. Not every mystery wants to be solved. Some are content to sit quietly at the edge of knowing, half-lit and patient, as if waiting for us to forget the questions entirely. And somewhere, beyond the borders of the last charted land, beyond the last marked tree and broken compass, there is a place that does not appear on any map because it does not wish to. It is not hidden. It is not protected. It simply recedes, like a shoreline pulling away from the tide of curiosity. No one arrives there on purpose. The stories always begin the same way, with someone lost, someone off course, someone looking for something else. A hiker trying to shortcut across an old valley. Pilot forced to make an unscheduled landing. A child who wandered too far from the house, chasing a sound their parents didn't hear. And then they find it. Not suddenly, but as if remembering. The place is always quiet, never abandoned, just still. The trees are older, but not wild. The air carries no birdsong, only the suggestion of it, like a song hummed just out of memory. Structures exist, but they resist shape. Not ruined, not intact. Stone that forgets its own angles. Paths that twist gently back to where they started, though your footprints insist you've gone somewhere new. One man, a surveyor from the Netherlands in 1971, spoke of finding a clearing surrounded by tall, arching trees. In the center stood a monolith, not large, not carved, just a dark stone, smooth on one side. He touched it, heard nothing, felt nothing, but when he returned to his notes that evening, pages were missing. Not torn, not moved, just gone as if never written. His field diary skips 2 days. The ink resumes mid-sentence, unsure what it was saying. When he left the forest, he found his car rusted. The tires collapsed. The radio was playing static, though the battery was dead. He never returned. And yet, he never stopped sketching that monolith over and over with fewer details each time, until, finally, he drew only a blank square. The last page was empty, except for one word at the bottom, near. In the 1990s, a small group of amateur explorers attempted to trace a path using GPS, satellite images, and fragments of local legend. They entered a forest believed to be somewhere along the Carpathian Arc, where the terrain folds into itself like forgotten cloth. They set up camp, sent nightly updates. On the 4th day, the messages stopped. No storm, no interference, just silence. A week later, one of them returned, alone. She walked out of the woods barefoot, her clothes damp, her voice nearly gone. When asked where she had been, she said, "I wasn't lost. It was." She could not recall what it was, only that the others had stayed behind, not because they were trapped, but because they'd been asked to. In her backpack, they found a sealed envelope. Inside was a photograph of an empty field, but when held up to light, faint outlines emerged. A building with no doors, a tree with no roots, and something in the far distance. A shape without detail, a suggestion. Scholars have attempted to chart the recurring patterns, cross-referencing accounts, lining up disappearance points, overlaying timelines. But the data never holds. Coordinates shift. Names unspell themselves. Journals fade at the corners as if exposure to air or time is too much for them. And always the final entries blur, not from water or smudge, but as if the paper itself is tired of telling the story. Some believe the place is a fold in space. Others call it an echo of a world that wasn't chosen, a version of here that stepped to the side and now survives in the gaps between decisions. The rest say nothing, because how do you speak of a place that refuses language, that unnames itself the moment you leave? And why does it always seem to know when you've come looking for it, versus when you've simply forgotten your way? A traveler once claimed he reached the place not by walking, but by stopping. Completely. He lay down in a forest, closed his eyes, and listened until he couldn't remember the shape of sound. When he opened them again, he was there, but he says he left before he was noticed, because he felt that if he lingered too long, the place might choose to remember him and never let go. Today, those who speak of the place often do so by accident, in dreams, in a half-remembered turn-off an unmarked road, in the sudden feeling that you've passed through somewhere thinner, lighter, wrong in a way you can't describe. And once you've known that feeling, it stays, just at the edge of perception, a tension in the air, a hush in the leaves, the sense that something once opened its eyes, looked at you, and chose to close them again, not out of fear, but mercy, because maybe some places were not meant to be found. Maybe some stories were meant only to be almost told. And maybe in the silence that follows, what matters most is not that we solved them, but that we listened. And that night, far from roads, beneath stars that did not match any known sky, a traveler turned his head and saw his shadow pause, just for a moment, as if something else was casting it.